Hello, listeners of the Mad Scientist podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cogswell, here today joined by a special guest. I am joined by Dr. Caleb Lack. Caleb, how you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me on, Chris.
No problem. Thank you so much for coming on. So today we are going to continue our series on first the history of kind of Christian mysticism all the way up to the modern day of exorcism and more wide-ranging and I think a little bit more intense and in some ways to me a little bit more scary conspiracy theory and thought on the internet about the current reach of satanic cults. So in an upcoming episode here, we're actually going to hear from the Church of Satan, a group that's in no way really associated with this stuff in any actual way, but is often used as a kind of scapegoat, I suppose. And in this episode, I wanted to talk to someone who's trained at least to kind of give some of these opinions and ideas here. So why don't you give the listeners a little bit of background on yourself, please?
Sure. So I'm a professor of psychology and a clinical psychologist at the University of Central Oklahoma. My background is in working mostly in terms of clinical stuff with folks who have really super severe anxiety problems, obsessive compulsive disorder, social anxiety, Tourette's disorder, things like that. So that's kind of my clinical background. So as part of that, you have to be very familiar with kind of a lot of the things I think we'll be talking about today in terms of mental health. And then I also have a secondary kind of specialization in critical thinking. So for the last 13, 14 years at this point, I've taught courses in critical thinking and science and pseudoscience. And I have my most recent book is a best-selling textbook on critical thinking. So I'm kind of well-versed in a lot of these issues because they come up, unfortunately, all too often.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. As a show, that was kind of our, I guess, the beginning of the show's history. That was sort of our focus, was trying to combat pseudoscience, trying to promote critical thinking by really picking apart these claims, these ideas that are out there and looking at them in a more serious way. And with that, though, it's almost inevitable. You kind of get sucked into some of these people's worlds, right? You start to discuss with them, I think I was abducted by aliens, or I think I saw a ghost for real, right? It's, the human aspect of it becomes very, very interesting. And I think really that's the thing that makes people believe these stories is they can't fathom a case where they themselves would, misremember or confabulate or, what have you, these things. But one thing I always try to tell people, and I say it on the show a lot, is, the human, one thing that we never really discuss with each other is the actual mechanism of our thinking. Right? So,
yeah.
So why don't you give us kind of, I guess, from your perspective, as a trained clinical psychologist, how would you explain, I guess, some of these cases, say, of, paranormal events or high strangeness?
Yeah. So, when I teach critical thinking, it's fairly similar into how I treat somebody who has some sort of mental health problem, which is that you can't start by just saying, so here's where you're wrong. Mm-hmm. Or, no, that's not right. Because it turns out that doesn't work. And people will just be like, okay, whatever, screw you. And then they'll stop listening, right? So what you actually have to do first, and what we do in the critical thinking classes, is we teach you why, basically, you can't trust your own brain all the time. That's actually the subtitle of my last book. Because we all naturally have these often very, very useful biases and heuristics that we employ on a day-to-day basis whenever we encounter information in the world around us. Mm. And we also have all these, I would say, kind of perceptual glitches that are a product of our evolutionary history that don't work so well in certain modern situations. And so the very first thing that I, really focus on in my critical thinking classes is, okay, how do we know what it is that we actually know and what it is that we don't know, but we pretend to know, or, believe that I actually know. And I think you have to lay that sort of groundwork in terms of why do I believe what it is that I do believe? Because if I don't, and I just start, popping right into debunking, what we know from research is that people will not just ignore you, but they'll become more entrenched in their beliefs if you just say you're wrong, even if you provide, wonderful factual evidence for them. Mm-hmm. And so you really have to teach people how to question themselves and how to be okay with questioning themselves, which is very tricky a lot of times. And you have to go about it in a fairly slow process. And it's very similar to what we do in psychotherapy, effective cognitive behavioral therapies, which is you have to educate somebody first about what it is they're experiencing. And then you have to work with them to help them test their own beliefs out. And you can't just say, don't be depressed, don't be anxious, right? That doesn't work.
It's always been interesting to me because it almost seems like, we go back to kind of a Socratic approach, right? Where you're questioning, right, your perceptions, you're questioning your mind, and you're trying to think, because when people tell me, I do a monthly radio show on Spaced Out Radio where it's kind of myself and then another sort of skeptic. I get, he doesn't really like to call himself a skeptic, but someone who's very critical of these kind of things, right? And then it's the two of us discussing with someone who has had his own experiences and really feels like some of this stuff is really real. And the thing that I keep coming back to is, well, your mind tricks you all the time, right? Like you misremember things constantly. I mean, I do it too, right? We all do it, and we all have we just don't talk about it, right? I mean, I remember one of the scariest kind of memories I have as a kid is lying at night I hated really dark rooms. I hated completely dark rooms. And the reason I hated them was because I would lay there and I would kind of see basically like visual hallucinations almost of colors, right? Like pops of colors and whatever. And when I finally, worked up the courage to go see a psychologist about it as an adult, the psychologist basically told me, and this was someone that I was seeing for other things, for my own anxiety disorders, basically was like, oh yeah, we hear that in kids sometimes. It's just kind of it's called like what was it called? Like chromo something, whatever. But it's like it's a relatively common occurrence. And because I had not, but it scared me. It scared me terribly as a kid, right? And it's kind of that thing where we don't talk to each other about these, the mechanism of thinking or the way that you cognate an event or even anything else. And so, you just assume that other people think the way you do, or that other people have the same mental mechanisms or whatever as you do, and that's not always the case.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I do a lot of when I teach critical thinking is I share sort of my own biases or I share the way that my brain has fooled me before. Mm-hmm. Just this week, actually, we were focusing on aliens and alien abduction, and I got to tell my class about how for about the last 35 years, so about as far back as I can remember, I've actually experienced sleep paralysis and hypnagogic hallucinations. Mm-hmm. And those, for in case your listeners don't know, so sleep paralysis is where you feel like you wake up in the middle of the night. You can open your eyes and move your eyes around generally, but the rest of your body is still paralyzed. And typically your autonomic nervous system's highly activated. So my heart's about to beat out of my chest. I'm sweating. I'm breathing heavy. And you feel like you can't move. And sleep paralysis is pretty common. Most people experience it maybe once or twice in their life. And it's terrifying if you don't know what it is. It's also terrifying even if you do know what it is, because your body is freaking out.
Right.
And your brain is like, hey, it's okay. And your body's like, it's obviously not okay, or I wouldn't be doing this right now. And so then I have, again, had that for, over 3 decades. And then mine is often combined with hypnagogic hallucinations, which are the hallucinations you have when you're, going from a sleep to awake state. And so I tell my students about how I, for example, very frequently wake up, again, in this sort of panic, terrified, paralyzed state, and see large, dark, shadowy figures moving around my bedroom. Or occasionally I'll have tactile hallucinations where I will feel things happening, like a large snake like moving across my body. And they'll, they sort of look at me like, oh my gosh, I'm taking a class from this guy. Like, what's going on? But then I can then weave that into, here's how these experiences impact, how you experience the world and sort of how you interpret the world, particularly in terms of people who think they've been abducted by aliens, right? Because almost everybody who claims to have been abducted by aliens has those kinds of experiences, those paralysis and hallucinatory experiences. And how I consider myself a fairly well-read person, but I had no idea what was going on until I got to college, and happened just briefly, we started talking about it in the first intro psych class I ever had, the very first introduction to psychology I'd had. And my professor, Bill Scott, just sort of mentioned it as an aside, and I was like, whoa, hold on.
Right, go back to that part, please.
Let's step back a minute. Are you saying that this is a thing?
Right.
I hadn't told anyone about it. Because I was like, I am crazy. Like, I'm waking up and seeing things in my room, and we'll just keep that to ourselves. And I think we have a lot of things like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So yours is a good example of that, or somebody who sees or hears something that they're sort of not able to explain readily, and they're, instead of seeking out like, okay, what is this? It's more of I'm gonna just keep that to myself, or I interpret that based on what I already believe, whether that's ghosts or aliens or witches or whatever it happens to be.
Right. It is really, I think, it's instructive for, I love that you use that in class. I wish I could take that class with you. That sounds absolutely fascinating. So how common would you say, just kind of, you probably don't have I'm sure you don't have the stats in front of you, but how common would you say kind of, I guess, I don't even know if hallucination is the right word, but how common is like a thinking error, I suppose, where something like that could happen? Like, would you say everyone experiences them a couple times in their lives? Would you say it's only some people? You know what I mean? If you feel comfortable quantifying that.
Sure. Yeah. In terms of our thinking errors or our cognitive biases, all of us have those. Literally everyone, and we interpret our world based on those. So if I, for instance, if I think that ghosts are a real phenomenon, and I happen to catch something out of the corner of my eye, while I'm on a ghost hunt, I'm automatically saying, oh, yep, that was a ghost, as opposed to, I don't think it's a ghost, so I catch the same thing out of the corner of my eye, and I think, oh, that was just a trick of the light, or, oh, that was just, a cloud, or whatever it happened to be. So all of this time have our cognitive biases at play. And that the big one of those is what we call the confirmation bias, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with. But yeah, that's where you interpret the information around you. If it confirms what you believe, then you just sort of accept it and say, hey, come on in, right? Like, that's great. I'm just going to take that. And then if it goes against what you believe, you naturally just discount it and, find flaws with it and ignore it and forget about it very quickly. So all of us have those. As far as these more like odd sensory experiences, they're actually extremely common. So some of our larger scale, we don't ask about it in a direct way, because if we say, hey, have you had a hallucination? People tend to be like, no, right. I'm not crazy. But if we ask about it in more subtle ways, like, have you ever heard someone call your name and then you've looked around and no one's there? Or have you ever, seen something and then you looked at it more closely and it wasn't there? When we ask about these things in more subtle ways, we find a very significant percentage of the population, maybe 25 to 35%, have experienced, various kinds of sensory hallucinations. And this is not a weird thing. It doesn't mean that you're schizophrenic or something like that. It's just, it's a thing that a lot of people experience, but they don't think about it, right? Or they don't know that it's so common.
How would you quantify what that actually, because I'm thinking myself, right? I always joke with friends that if you have a cat, you have probably at least once a week looked at a pile of clothes on the floor or a wrapper or a leaf or something, whatever, in the corner of your eye and thought, oh, it's my cat. And then you look around and it's something else,
sure,
right? Like cats, I think, are lousy for mini hallucinations. They are, they're these little balls of trickery, right? Is that something that you would quantify as one of those events, or is it something more? Does it have to be something more significant?
Yeah, so that is more just a misidentification, right? So, okay. And we see that all the time in huge numbers in different ways. But that's more just like there's an actual thing in my environment and I misidentified it, right? Or I placed my belief system onto that. So I'm, if you've got a cat, for example, you're very primed to see cat-like shapes because you're seeing a cat all the time.
Right, and the cat owns your brain, so it's
right, yeah.
Okay.
And so you're very primed to see that. So you see something vaguely cat-like and your brain automatically latches onto, oh, that's the cat. And then you're like, oh, wait, no, that's just a shadow. But that's different from actually having like a hallucinatory experience where there's not any external stimuli, and yet I interpret it that way.
Okay. So the difference there is, I get that distinction now then. So it's literally that so this would be something like, the corner of your eye, you think you see a person passing, and then you look behind and there isn't a person, or like you said, you hear your name called, and then, but you're the only one in the house or something.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Got it. Okay.
And what's really amazing about those kinds of experiences is, again, there's no external stimuli. But when we look at how the brain is activated and processing information when you're having hallucinations, there's no difference between me actually hearing a sound, an external, real sound, and me having an auditory hallucination. The exact same parts of the brain are involved in processing that. Same parts of your brain are highly active and activated. To your brain, it is real. And I think that's a really important thing for people to understand. It's not that I'm just making this up. It's that as far as my brain's concerned, that is there. Like, that is a real phenomenon.
It's so funny. I don't know if you've ever listened to the Ricky Gervais podcast.
Yeah.
Okay, so I love the part where, Carl always gets into it where he's like, well, my brain thinks this, but I think this. And they're, and Ricky and Steve are like, you're not separate operatives. Like you are your brain, right? But I know at least for me, when I started my own, kind of mental health journey, I guess, so just full disclosure, and the listeners know this already, but, I've been diagnosed with OCD and other kind of anxiety-ish things, right? But and personally, for me, on my own kind of whatever lifetime so far, a lot of the things that I thought at one time were paranormal-esque, right, or kind of oh, this is weird. I wonder what this is. Now I look back at them and I'm like, your brain was tricking you, idiot. Like
Right,
it's,
right.
with hindsight, you can kind of see them that way. But it is so fascinating though, because, it is sort of that dichotomy or that hardness of, well, to your brain, it's real, but it's not really real. And now a part of your brain seems to know that it's not real, but the other part was like, no, it's real. Like you just get into that, that car, and then you end up looking and feeling like Carl Pilkington, right? You're just sitting there with your thumb in your mouth, like, oh my goodness, I don't know what's happening.
Yeah.
It's so, it's fascinating.
That's all too common. I mean, for me personally, when I have, my hypnagogic hallucinations, I can have a little small part of my brain that's going like, hey, it's cool. We know this isn't real.
Right.
Let's all just calm down. And the other part of my brain is, going, oh my God, there's a bear in the house, and just, flipping out. And it's just like, well, it's hard to argue with yourself when you're, as far as your brain's concerned, there is a bear walking down the hall,
Right. Right.
I don't have a bear, it's obviously a wild bear. So, I mean, it is tough though. And that's, I think one of the most difficult parts about becoming a good critical thinker is that willingness to accept that I'm wrong sometimes and I can be wrong. And you have to kind of doubt yourself a lot more than the average person does. And it's not a natural thing for us to do. But it's needed for, being a good critical thinker.
Right. Absolutely. So the original reason that I reached out to you was because we're doing a series now on sort of the history of, so one of my favorite, it is my favorite kind of spooky topic, I guess you'd say, right? So the show, we kind of try to do equal bits of science and spookiness and, teach critical thinking and teach science by talking about this kind of sci-fi horror stuff that people like, and frankly, me and Marie love as well. But so one of, I think the reason that it's so fascinating to me, this topic, is because it scared me so much as a kid, is this idea of demonology and Christian mysticism, angelology, right? These kind of very complicated, systems of, it's almost like a Tolkien-esque cast of characters and mythos and rules and whatever. And, one fascinating aspect of that is exorcism, of course, but also I think in the modern day, and this is the topic that we're going to get to at the kind of end of the series, is this idea of people today truly believing that they have been in some ways affected or hurt or abducted or whatever by, for lack of a better term, satanic cults, right? Or the Illuminati or these other groups. I've just been devouring books on this topic for years, but even to the point where you see these people who are writing, and I mean, who knows if they're telling the truth or not, but they claim, I have cut off all contact with my family. I have completely moved away. My wife and children and whatever are still part of the cult, and whatever. And one thing that comes up often is this idea of dissociative identity disorder. They claim that this is the MK Ultra-esque way that these cult groups or whatever have been able to break them down. So first off, this is like a super loaded question, I suppose, now that I've given all this background stuff for you to talk about. But, first off, what is your take on those kind of stories, or what do you think? How would you, as a psychologist or someone with your background, how would you view those stories? That's kind of question one.
So, yeah, good question. And it really depends on what your training in mental health is, right? So my background in training in mental health is very much from a scientific point of view. So in my training in graduate school, there was a huge emphasis on research. and on using what we call EBPs, or evidence-based practices. And those are, what is it that we know works for a particular problem? And we know it works not because, oh, hey, I think it works, but because we have good, controlled clinical data to show that it does work for particular problems. So my background is, and many, not all, but many clinical psych programs have that kind of an emphasis. But that's not the emphasis that a lot of mental health practitioners get in their training. A lot of practitioners really don't have that sort of emphasis on what I would call the more scientific aspects of mental health or treatment, and instead rely more on, well, this is how I feel, right? Or this is how I think, this is my pet theory, as opposed to, well, here's what we actually have research to back up. So I can tell you how I answer that, and then I can also tell you how other people would answer it, right? So, so for me, when I hear allegations about things like ritualistic abuse and satanic abuse, I immediately have kind of, two responses. One, which is, we know that unfortunately, abuse of children is all too common, and happens, way more than it should, which it should happen zero. So any more than that, it's too much. But it does happen. It happens a lot. And it's primarily done by family members. That's the most dangerous group for a child to be around, is a family member, because they're the ones who are most likely to abuse them. So I automatically say, okay, well, is there a chance that this person was abused, as a child, which for a lot of people coming into mental health services, they certainly could be. And then second, what is the kind of extent of their reports and their memories and their, details for these kinds of things. So when somebody starts talking about, these kind of sadistic or ritualistic kinds of abuse situations, you always have to try and think about, like, okay, well, what information have they been exposed to? What other potential therapists have they seen? Where does that come from? Because, as you guys, I'm sure you're well aware, we had this whole sort of moral panic starting in the 1980s about satanic ritual abuse, right? Where you've got Geraldo doing specials on it, and Oprah Winfrey doing specials on it, and the entire country is just consumed with the fact that all these Satanists are murdering babies and controlling Procter and Gamble, and doing all of these crazy things. So does that person have that kind of a background? Because sadly, I have seen cases of abuse that, they're not from a satanic point of view, but they're certainly sadistic and fairly ritualistic. And, they have a lot of those qualities, but are they happening as a result of some sort of satanic cult? And the answer to that question is no. Right. I mean, they're not. All of the investigations that have occurred, and I'm not talking about like me, I'm talking about things like, the FBI. They've never found any evidence of, these sort of widespread satanic cults, because they don't exist. And so if someone does have those memories, though, or it has that belief, what I do is I try and understand, what's going to be the thing that's going to help them increase their quality of life the most. Because it turns out that it doesn't matter if something's a false memory or not, whether or not something really truly occurred. It's how am I responding to that memory that's important. And I'll give you an example. So in the early 2000s, there was a very well-known trauma researcher who was out of Harvard, who got interested in alien abductions. In particular, the people who claimed they'd been abducted. His name's Richard McNally.
Mm-hmm.
And McNally started researching these people who thought they were abducted by aliens. And as one of his studies, he brought in combat veterans from Vietnam, and he compared their physiological responses when they were recounting the stories of the trauma they experienced in Vietnam to the physiological responses of these people who claimed to be abducted by aliens when they were recounting their abduction experience. Now, we know those abduction experiences aren't real. We know those are false memories. We know the Vietnam experiences were real, like he had, treatment records and service records for these folks.
Mm-hmm.
And what he found was that there was no difference in terms of the physiological reactivity between the abductees and the combat veterans.
Wow.
So in other words, it doesn't matter that these people had false memories. They were still having obviously very, very highly significant negative responses to those false memories. And so that's something I always keep in mind, which is that it doesn't matter if something's objectively true. It's how I think about it that interprets or changes how it is that I respond to it, right? So if I have somebody who, really is convinced that they've had these kinds of experiences, I can still treat their post-traumatic stress symptomology, their anxiety, their depression, even if what's, maybe at least partially causing that isn't quote unquote real.
So that brings an interesting question though, because I would anticipate that if you believed that something traumatic happened to you, right? I guess I could see the argument, or I guess I could see it's not even an argument, right? I guess I could see the fact that whether or not the trauma actually occurred doesn't matter. If it's been traumatizing you enough that you seek out psychological help, right? Then clearly it doesn't really matter if the trauma really occurred or not, because to your brain it did occur. But I guess for me though, so I guess I have two questions. The first one would be, doesn't the fact that the trauma didn't occur mean something, or doesn't it help to kind of if I thought that I was being chased by, let's use your own, I'm being chased by a bear. If I thought I was being chased by a bear and I was, running down the hallway terrified, and then I, look back and I realize that it's not actually a bear, it's a puppy, right? That would alleviate my fear. That would alleviate my trauma in the moment. But I guess what you're saying is that because it's already become ingrained in the mind in some way, it doesn't necessarily matter if it was true or not.
Yeah, well, so as part of this work, what you would do is you would certainly do education on, the non-veracity of things like satanic abuse, right?
Okay.
But just telling somebody that something that they remember vividly didn't happen isn't going to actually make them be like, oh, well, never mind then.
Right, like you said, it'll entrench them more.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So what you have to do is you treat it the same as you would any other traumatic memory, and this is not unique to something like believing that you were ritually abused. Our research has shown that it's much more important how dangerous you think a situation is in terms of a traumatic event, not the actual danger of it. So some of our research, for example, looked at the actual level of damage to a child's home during a tornado compared to their perception of the level of damage and how much of a danger they were actually in.
Sure.
And the objective amounts of damage and the objective sort of danger are not related to a person's long-term trauma response. Instead, it's their interpretation of that situation as it occurs.
Sure.
So even later going back and being like, oh, well, you know what, it blew 2 shingles off the house, I shouldn't be worried about that. Well, no, because you thought you were going to die during it. So
Right.
therefore, that's really what causes the problem.
That makes
sense. Yeah. So it's all about, kind of reducing that reactivity to the memories, and then allowing that to sort of help you reinterpret what was going on.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. So it's kind of you first lower that flight or fight response, and then you kind of can help to ease and discuss further those experiences and come to some conclusion about the truth or falsehood of them.
Yeah, and we with that, we most commonly use an exposure-based protocol where it's exposure and response prevention.
Sure, yeah.
Which you might be familiar with.
I am absolutely familiar with. I'll never forget. I actually, when I was first, I tell this story sometimes to friends. Never shared it on the show before. I don't think, maybe I did, but when I was first seeking treatment, the thing that really, I kind of had already been sort of diagnosed. I knew I might have PTSD or some kind of anxiety disorder from childhood, whatever. And I remember I went in for a test where they were like, well, this was before I was even admitted to the overall kind of psych program at Mass General Hospital, where they were like, oh, we're doing tests of people that have these kind of things, whatever. We'll, pay you $20, right? Come in, do the study for us, right? And I was a poor graduate student, so $20 was like, that's like 2 pizzas and a beer. This is great, right? And so I went in and did it, and I'll never forget. I left that test, and I was like, well, I definitely need to go seek treatment because this is out of hand. The test was, those black and white, sort of like, what's the word? Almost an optical illusion board, where you look and you don't see anything, and then if your eyes kind of relax and focus, you see a schooner.
Yeah.
Right. Or a sailboat right from Mallrats. Right. So the test was, if you see an egg in this image, you would push a button. And if you didn't see it, you would push another button. And it was timed. It was like 3 seconds. Right. And that stupid egg made me so anxious. Like I couldn't go to class the rest of the day. I was like, I'm at like a 9, right? I was so anxious leaving this stupid test. And I remember going home, and my fiance at the time, now my wife, was like, what's the matter? And I was like, the stupid eggs. And I explained it to her, and she was like, well, I mean, I don't know what that's about, but oh man, it was, I'm sure now it was a mix of like the anxiety of not being able to see it and what it being able to see it mean. And, just all of it was like a perfect crescendo, right? But man, I will never forget those damn eggs. Anyways, so I guess one question I have is, so they're discussing in many cases this idea of dissociative identity disorder.
Sure.
And along with that, they almost create a very complicated mythos, I guess, for a lack of a better word, like almost a universe around themselves, right? Where there's these members of the cult that exist in the shadows of their town, and all this. In some cases it gets very detailed. At least it seems like on the internet when you read these stories.
Yeah.
First off, what is the clinical reality, or I guess significance, the level of dissociative identity disorder? What even is it supposed to be? If you have that kind of, if you feel comfortable having that kind of discussion, and then on top of that too, how common is it to create that kind of mythos, or that that self-image of, it just seems very complicated. It seems so convoluted, and it seems like that it takes so much energy to create this mythos. It's hard to see, why do it, right? So again, another tremendously loaded question for you, but yeah, yeah.
Well, let me talk kind of about the mythos part first, and then I'll come to the dissociative identity part.
Sure.
So, So humans are very naturally storytellers. This is one of the reasons why just presenting data to people often doesn't work unless you're, a mutant sort of scientist like us, for example, right? Instead, stories stick with people much more. They have much more impact because that's what we do. Like, we naturally try to make sense of the world around us. Our brains are storytelling machines. So whenever anything occurs around me, I try and make sense of it, right? And I try and put it in some sort of context where I can better understand what's going on. And this, goes from, more small scale events like, okay, well, why hasn't she texted me back? To larger scale things like, why am I experiencing the severe health problems that I'm experiencing? And so, when people are having mental health difficulties, whatever that is, almost inevitably, they have some sort of unique to them explanation of why they think this is occurring. What is it that is happening around me that's causing me to experience X or Y? So if, for example, I'm experiencing huge amounts of anxiety in some way, most people come up with some sort of explanation for that. And that could be, it's because, I was treated this way when I was a child, or it could be, because this or that's going on around me in terms of my environment right now. But we all make those stories up. And if I'm experiencing, let's say, false memories, or what someone else would call false memories about ritualistic abuse or things like that, what I'll often try and do is I'll try and come up with stories that help me then avoid further things that might make that worse. Right? And this is no different from what, all of our ancestors did in terms of trying to control their environment, being, prone to, let's say, sacrificing a goat in order to, help ensure that X or Y happens, or performing some sort of a ritual to help curry the favor of this or that particular deity. But it's just more of an iatrogenic individual level, right? So if I know to avoid that person, and I know that these people are all involved in this, then I can warn other people, and we can all together avoid this from happening to us again, or from happening to my children, or things like that. And again, all of us do that in various ways. It's just that most of us don't end up with these ridiculously complicated sort of mythos, right? So these stories about what's going on. But if I have, for example, thinking that I am or have been part of this sort of satanic cult and abused as a child, it turns out it's really easy to find information to confirm that. Just like with any belief that we have, it's much easier to confirm them than it is to disconfirm them, which is obviously why science works the way that it does, right? But I can look for other people on the internet, and I can just go type in satanic abuse, right? Or signs of satanic abuse, and I can come up with probably hundreds to thousands of websites in 30 seconds. They're all going to reinforce that this is exactly what happened to me, right? And then I can find all these books written by supposed experts that do the exact same thing. And I mean, this is not a new thing in terms of, people being able to find confirmation for the beliefs, however wild and wacky they might be. But it's a hell of a lot easier now, thanks to the internet. Because, as your listeners may or may not be aware, people can lie on the internet.
they know that, but they know that no one lies on a podcast, and it's very important, true. Listeners. Buy our crystals. Buy our crystals.
That is very true.
What? So, so before even I'm putting even more questions to you before you can answer the second part of the first question. What do you think then that these people have? Because do you think that these people have actually had or experienced real trauma? And I guess like you said, that doesn't really matter, right? It's their brain's perception, or it's their brain's feeling of trauma. I guess I just wonder, could this be one common I guess kind of refrain you hear with this stuff, right? It's the same with alien abduction stories too, and everything else, is that these are people covering up with their, with this larger mythos, them actually being abused, right? Or something traumatic, or something that they're ashamed of, or whatever, occurring, in their lives, in their childhoods, whatever. But does it even take first off, what do you think about those explanations? But secondly, would it even take a real event to happen? Could it all be in someone's, I guess, head, even if they feel the trauma is real?
Yeah, very good question. And this actually relates back to one of your earlier questions about dissociative identity disorder. So the majority of people who have these kinds of memories about being satanically abused, most of those memories were elicited or quote unquote recovered during things like hypnotic regression.
That was my next question for you.
Okay. Okay.
Perfect.
No, I'm just anticipating. It's my psychic powers.
Yeah, no, we've just proved it, folks.
But honestly, that's what happens. Most people, maybe they're feeling upset or depressed or anxious, and they don't really understand why, and they happen to go to a therapist who is one of these. We don't see as many now, thankfully, but particularly in the 80s, we had all these therapists who were doing these quote unquote recovered memory techniques, right? Where, well, let's get to what really happened. And so they would, put people under quote unquote hypnosis and then regress them to, whatever ages they wanted to regress, quote unquote, them to. And then one of the things that a lot of people misunderstand about hypnosis is that, oh, well, if I'm hypnotized, I can't lie. Well, it turns out, no, hypnosis is basically just a relaxive, suggestible sort of state. But if I think that I can't lie during hypnosis, then it turns out that I just start talking. And if I am then in the presence of someone who's asking very particularly leading questions, which most of these people did, then what happens is you start implanting false memories. And there doesn't have to be any sort of truth to that in the first place. And we know this from very, very strong decades worth of experimental psychology research, is that I can implant a false memory in someone pretty easily, even if there's no grain of truth. It's much easier if it's similar to something that could have happened. But I can still do it even though there's not anything there to kind of hang my hat on, as it were, in terms of building extra memory on top of. And so when you've got, I would say these very unethical therapists who are doing this sort of thing, then what happens is you then start, quote unquote, recalling your memories. And one of the things that most people don't understand about memory is that memory is not recollective, it's reconstructive. So if I ask you, Chris, I say, well, what'd you have for breakfast last Tuesday? There's a really good chance that unless it was some sort of unique phenomenon last Tuesday that you had it during breakfast, that you're not actually recalling it as much as you are just reconstructing it. So what do I typically have? Where do I typically eat? When am I doing this? And you just kind of build that memory each time, even for things that we really, strongly feel is, a highly accurate memory. We still do the same thing in terms of reconstructing it rather than just recollecting it. And so if I'm, with one of these therapists that is helping to, at least plant some seeds of false memories and asking me leading questions, and I feel like I can't lie because I'm under hypnosis and I feel a strong pressure to respond in a particular way, then all of a sudden I start building these false memories very, very quickly about, I remember dad took me and my sister down into the basement, and he murdered her and he buried her underneath the back corner, and that's where her bones are, and there's no record of you ever having a sister, right? And you go dig that up and there's nothing there. And then, well, I'm either making all of this up, or I start building onto that mythos, right, of, well, they're controlling the police and they're controlling the records of X or Y.
And you would never think that you were the one making it up, right? You would. No, it's not a. I don't think that's a very common. I can't imagine that being a very common feeling for someone.
No, I mean, not for anyone in general. Like, think about just your own self. Like, how often do you like admitting that you're wrong? My guess is probably not very often, because most of us don't like to do that.
Right. Sure.
Now, how likely would you be to easily admit that you're wrong about something that's become such a huge part of who you are?
Man, yeah, that's so interesting.
Even less likely.
Yeah.
So this sort of, regression techniques and things like that, all of which are completely non-scientific and are actually based on these pseudoscientific ideas of things like repressed memories, which is not a real thing. We forget. We don't repress. But these sort of cycles form over and over and over again, right? Whether it's the panic about witches in Salem, or whether it's the panic about satanic cults, or whether it's the panic about terrorists next door, or whatever it is. We see these things happen over and over again, and if you've got vulnerable people who are not being treated well in terms of their mental health care, and instead are being treated by folks who are using these dubious techniques, then that just sets a breeding ground up for people developing these false memories and then responding to them as if they were real.
Sure. It's it's so interesting. I mean, I think it's that you mentioned the cycles, right? This idea that these things kind of keep coming, and that's one thing that we try to really harp on a lot on the show is, the main way that you can tell a pseudoscientific belief from a scientific one is the pseudoscientific belief never changes. It just comes back in a new form, right? So, the idea of witches, originally was the idea of the Furies or whatever, and then it became witches, and then it became, aliens, and now it's Illuminati agents, and the idea of someone coming at the night, stealing you from your bed, and then doing terrible things to you has been around since the beginning of time, right? As far as we can tell. So, in the face of evidence, it just kind of morphs. It doesn't actually go away. So I guess as a last question here, one thing that I always struggle with, because I, as the host of this show and as someone who's interested in this stuff, I spend a lot of time on Facebook groups. I don't interact or anything, but I spend a lot of time on these Facebook groups kind of lurking, and seeing people who are, there's one group that I'm part of, that's called Pleiadians and reptilians and whatever, right? And these people are convinced that they are alien starseeds. And so for anyone that doesn't know, a starseed is a person who has been either soul implanted, or they have been literally put here by aliens in some way, or so their mother was impregnated by an alien or whatever. And there's this one girl in particular, this one woman in particular, I should say, who I've wanted to contact, but I always hesitate because I don't think it would be fair to her. It wouldn't even be on the podcast, because I don't think it would be fair to have her on the podcast for her own. I don't think it'd be fair to her, right? But I'm always fascinated in talking to her and just understanding her worldview, because she does Facebook Live things where she talks about how, my aura is really low today. The aliens are telling me this and this, and the world is coming to a close, and we need to bring our energy back and whatever. And the comments, hundreds of these comments, are all positive, are all like, yeah, you're right. You know, my aura's been feeling it too today. And, you know, the dolphin told me this and, you know, whatever. Right. And in some ways it's like, in some ways it seems comical because it's a very like Lisa Frank view of the universe, right? You have these rainbows and, you know, happy aliens and love and whatever. But on the other hand, it's depressing to see that almost because you know that this is just delusion. This is, you know what I mean? And they're all just reinforcing each other. And I have such a hard time understanding, or I guess I wonder, as a psychologist, as someone who kind of deals with this stuff on a daily basis, how would you suggest a listener or someone or whatever, if a friend comes to you and says that they've had these experiences or they believe in this stuff or whatever, how do you deal with it? First off, you know, empathetically, like how do you treat these people with respect and dignity and kindness? But also, I mean, what do you suggest? I don't know. How do you as a person deal with that? Like, what do you do? Right?
Yeah. So, you know, the first thing, this is actually something I stress in my classes, is an idea that goes back to Baruch Spinoza, a philosopher from, you know, a small amount of time ago.
Sure.
Which is that, you know, I try my best to understand why someone believes what it is they believe, as opposed to just kind of ridiculing them for that belief.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And so being able to, you know, understand like what are the typical, you know, cognitive mechanisms that cause all of us to develop and then maintain and reinforce beliefs, which it doesn't matter what belief it is. It could be the belief that, you know, my parents love me, or the belief that I'm a star seed, or the belief that, you know, podcasts are worthy use of our time, or whatever it is, right? Whatever that belief is, they're all being maintained through the same kind of mechanisms. And those are, you know, cognitive, but also social, right? So this gal that you were talking about, I mean, she's obviously getting huge amounts of reinforcement and confirmation of her beliefs, right? So of course she's going to keep going back to those same people to get more of that, right? Just like if I have a particular religious belief, where do I go on Sunday morning? Well, I go to that church that shares my religious belief. I don't go to a different one, right? And be like, let's try this out. So I think that's the first thing that is important to do, and that really that helps with your being empathic and understanding, which is that this person has a different belief than I do about this. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily stupid just because of that. Instead, they're having their beliefs for the same reason I'm having mine. It's just that we have different beliefs. So related to that is then, you know, understanding specifically why they have this belief, right? Like in general, I know this is why beliefs form, but why is this person? So having them actually explain, you know, what evidence they have that has caused them to believe that they're a starseed, or that ghosts are real, or that they were ritualistically abused, or whatever it happens to be, and listening to that. And not just immediately starting to argue with it or anything, right? So just listening and then helping them, you know, helping them understand that you heard them by giving that back to them, right? So here's the information that you just gave me. Let me show you that I actually did pay attention, that I was listening. And you state it back to them so that they say, you know, yeah, like you're right. You did hear me. You do understand why I believe this. Because if someone that I'm interacting with doesn't right up front know that I'm hearing them, you know, if I'm just waiting my turn to talk, right, instead of actually hearing them, then they're just going to shut down, and you're not going to be able to open up that conversation again.
Sure. And
it's just going to be, oh, no, we're done. So instead, letting them know I'm hearing you, I'm understanding you. And then the best part, or the best thing to do at that point, is really to say, okay, well, here's something we agree on. I'll give you kind of a non-supernatural example, which is that I frequently interact with anti-vaxxers. Who, all the scientific evidence is obviously very against, and it's very dangerous not to vaccinate your children if at all possible. And so I'll listen to them, and I'll say, here's what you told me, here's why you have this belief. And then I'll list a point of agreement that we have, which is that we want our children to be healthy and safe.
Sure.
And so they know that I'm on the same page with them as that, right? And then I'll mention, okay, here's something I learned from you today that I didn't know. I've never heard this before, or I've never encountered this piece of information before, which just further reinforces, right? Like, hey, I'm hearing you, I'm listening to you. And it's only at that point, right, where they know that I've listened to them, they know that and feel that they've been heard. I say, here's where we agree, that I'll do any sort of rebuttal or criticism or anything like that.
Okay.
In general, this is what we call Rappaport's rules. Anatole Rappaport was a social psychologist who studied basically like, how do I get other people to listen to me when we disagree? And it's only then, they've been heard. I say, here's where we agree. Here's what I've learned from you, that I can then say, but have you thought about this? Or have you been exposed to this? And I've got a relatively unique skill set in that I'm a clinical psychologist, and it turns out that's what I do a lot, which is help people examine their own beliefs and behaviors. So I've got kind of a leg up on people, compared to the average person, because that's what I've been trained in and doing for, close to 2 decades at this point.
Right.
And I'll do a large amount of more Socratic style questioning. Again, I'm not telling them that they're wrong, but I'm helping ask questions to lead them to examine their own beliefs a little more carefully. And to me, I think that's the really critical point, is, helping other people examine their beliefs, because that's what we have to do, right? I can't just tell you you're wrong. You have to come to those conclusions yourself.
So that, yeah, I think that's really interesting. It's funny. It's kind of, definitely it matches similar to what I have found to be the most useful way actually to argue with people who are, I found it easier with I guess more cut and dry things, right? So for instance, when someone tells me that they don't believe in climate change, right? I always go into, well, why, right? Like, what part of the theory of greenhouse gas absorption of, light do you not agree with, right? Is it that CO2's molecular bonds aren't actually excited by this try to get into really the nitty gritty of it and try to pick apart, like, until finally they sort of realize, like, oh, well, actually, I don't know that much about this. Right. or I never knew there was so much of our science based on this idea. Right. And all of it works. So why am I disbelieving this one bit or whatever? But the part, I guess, I think, though, the part of listening and hearing them and whatever is really important. I mean, it's something that again, I think a lot of us don't like to necessarily call ourselves skeptics, just because it's been hit with that kind of brush of debunker, right? Of kind of a very strong, oh, you're wrong and you're stupid for thinking and whatever, but actually hearing these people, I mean, I always tell, whenever my colleagues or whoever ask me, well, why do you even waste your time with this podcast? Like, why do you care about these topics? It's because there's real people at the other end who really think this stuff is true, right? And so even if you don't think the story itself is true or the event happened, first off, it's worth talking to them about it, because what happened to them? How do they believe this stuff? But at the same time, too, I think it tells us so much about our own minds, about humanity in general, that it's worth looking at. But the part, I guess, as a final thing here, the part that I always struggle with is, when do you suggest that someone seek mental help, I guess, or a mental health diagnosis, or is that even the place of someone in the public to do?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is just because someone holds a belief that is false or inaccurate certainly in no way implies they have, some sort of mental health problem.
Absolutely. 100%.
Yeah. And, most of us hold beliefs in one way or another that are not necessarily accurate, right?
Yeah, I think the Rangers are going to win the Stanley Cup. It's not going to happen.
but boy, I'd like for it.
Right, love it. Right? It's not going to happen, though. Anyways.
Yeah. So I think the big thing to do and to think about in terms of, either for myself or for a friend or a family member is, is their functioning in terms of social functioning, emotional functioning, is it being negatively impacted by having these beliefs, right? And that could be true, right? Or it could be that this belief is useful to them in some sort of way. So this lady who thinks she's a starseed and, looks at her auras and whatnot, like maybe that works for her. Maybe that's helping her out in her life in some sort of way that it's a very useful belief, right?
Sure.
So for me, it's always about looking at, is this actually harmful to the individual?
Okay.
And would it be more harmful to remove said belief?
Okay, so it's more like, if your friend is into conspiracy theories and thinks the moon landing was fake and whatever, don't, whatever. It's just a false belief, right? You can have discussions, it's fine, right? But if your friend gets fired from his job because he's claiming his boss is a satanic agent or something, then maybe it's time to, have that rough discussion. That makes perfect sense.
Are there negative consequences as a result of this belief or that belief? So, as a more mundane example, one of my specialties is obsessive compulsive disorder. And,
sure.
It turns out there's a fairly good chunk of the population who has like one or two things that you might consider an obsession or a compulsion. But is it, I have to turn the radio up by twos, or is it, I have to, double tap the doorknob when I go by, and it's not really impacting my life negatively? Okay, well then just go on about your business, right? But if it's, like someone I saw last week who was taking an hour and a half to be able to get into bed because they had this extensive routine, like, yeah, that's problematic because they're not getting enough sleep and they're, they're really disturbed by it. Let's work on that.
Absolutely.
So I think it's that issue of, impacting my functioning and impacting my quality of life. Not that certainly things like conspiracy beliefs and whatnot can't do that, because they most certainly can. But, is it an impactful belief, right?
Right. No, that makes perfect sense. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This has really been, I think, one of my favorite episodes ever. This has been so fascinating. Anytime you want to come on and talk about anything, please let us know. We'd love to have you come back.
Okay, great.
Where can listeners find you, find more of your work, in critical thinking and whatever they're interested in?
So I've got a pretty extensive website at caleblack.com. And from there, you can find links to things like my YouTube page or Facebook page. I'm on Twitter, but I'm not very active on there. I'm much more active on Facebook. So if you guys, can find me on there, that's fine. And you can, sort of find links to my books or my research articles and things like that on my website as well.
Perfect. And we will we'll have links to a bunch of stuff in the show notes for this episode. Dr. Caleb Black, thank you again so much for coming on. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks. Okay, well, that's the end of the episode. Great. Oh, man, thank you. This was fascinating.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. I mean, that's why I'm in this field, because it's fascinating to me.
It's so funny. So I did my undergraduate studies were philosophy and chemical engineering, and I find though, like every day when I'm designing a stupid a heat exchanger or something or whatever, I'm like, man, I really should have done that philosophy psychology thing. I'm like, this was a mistake. But no, I love it. It's so good. Yeah. That's so fascinating, man. Good stuff. All right, man. Have a good day.
All right, thanks. Take care.
Bye. Thank you again, dear listeners, for listening to the Mad Scientist podcast. I have been your host, Chris Cogswell, joined by my co-host,
Marie Mayhew.
If you'd like to contact the show, please send us an email at themadscientistpodcast@gmail.com. That's all one word. You can also follow us on Twitter at MadScientistPod or at Team Giant Squid for Marie. And of course, you can see us on Facebook, on Instagram, and all over the internet as the Mad Scientist Podcast. And again, our logo is the one with the pumpkin head, so it's easy to see.
Mm-hmm.
If you've enjoyed the show tonight, please consider supporting us on Patreon, where the money that you give to us will help us to promote this show further, to make it better, and just to spend more time making it.
Yes, we love doing that.
We do love doing that. Our logo was designed by Carrie Shaheen. Our web design is done by Desdemona Howard.
Woohoo!
And our sound design is done by Jake Cardinal. Thanks again for listening.
Thank you. This has been a Damn It Chippy production.